The wind off the dam had a sound to it that winter, not howling, not crying, but warning. Like the land itself knew something was wrong. Folks slept easy that year, trusting concrete and numbers, never thinking that the graveyard shift cook with shadows under her eyes might be the only one seeing what they all refused to. When the pressure built and the snow started melting too soon, it wasn't the engineers or the suits who noticed first. It was Marty, the woman who hadn't slept in years, and by the time anyone listened, it was almost too late. Sometimes heroes don't wear badges. Sometimes they don't even look like they belong. But they stay awake so the rest of us can sleep through the night. What would you have done in her place? Drop your thoughts down in the comments. I read everyone. And if stories like this grip you like a midnight storm, hit that subscribe so you don't miss the next chapter. The wind, that winter high in the Rockies, had a bite like a cornered wolf. It howled around the edges of the Kestrel Dam project, a raw scar of human ambition gouged into the ancient stone. Down in the bones of the operation, where the generators hummed a sleepless song, Marty Jones moved like a ghost through the graveyard shift. She was a mechanic by trade, a cook by necessity for the night cruise, and a woman who hadn't known a full night's peace since the Willow Creek disaster. Years gone now. The one that had swallowed her best friend. Ben, whole, sleep, for Marty, was a closed door, the memory of its quiet room too painful to approach. So she walked, and she watched. They called her the odd night owl, sometimes with a chuckle, sometimes with a nervous glance. Marty knew what they saw, a woman whittled down by worry, her frame spare, almost brittle-looking beneath layers of flannel and denim. Her eyes, the color of a stormy twilight, were perpetually shadowed, twin pools reflecting a grief that time hadn't softened, only etched deeper. Her habit of making a solitary inspection of the machinery around 3 in the morning, when the cold was at its most bitter, and the silence of the mountains pressed in, did little to dispel the image of an eccentric. Ain't natural. A woman keepin' hours like that, fussin' over grease nipples when the rest of the world's dreamin'. Old Jed, the day shift foreman, had grumbled, loud enough for her to hear. Marty had just tightened a valve, her touch sure and practiced, more natural than a turbine seizing 'cause someone was dreamin' instead of checkin'. Jed, he just spat tobacco juice onto the frosted ground and walked away, while the daylight hours at Kestrel Dam pulsed with a frantic energy, a relentless race against deadlines and the ever-encroaching winter. The nights offered Marty a different rhythm, in the pre-dawn stillness, under the cold, in different stars. The dam whispered its secrets to her, and what she heard, what she saw, began to coil a cold knot of unease in her belly. It started small, a temperature sensor on a critical bearing, nudged just so, reading a few degrees cooler than reality. She found it during one of her 3 a.m. patrols. The faint, almost imperceptible scent of overheating oil, a smell she knew better than her own name, drawing her in. Then, a pressure valve, one designed to bleed off excess strain, was torqued far beyond its specified tolerance, not loose, which might suggest carelessness, but deliberately, dangerously tight, like someone wanted to see how much it could take before it screamed. And the welds, there were sections, hidden deep in the guts of the new intakes, that bore the telltale signs of a different hand, a different heat, not necessarily weaker, not yet, but other, an unsettling signature on a vital piece of work. Each anomaly, Marty meticulously recorded in a worn, leather-bound ledger she called her night journal. Dates, times, Precise locations marked on photocopied schematics, sketches of suspect components, her own spidery notes hypothesizing cause and effect. This journal was her confidant, the silent keeper of her growing dread. To most of the crew, men who wrestled with steel and concrete under the harsh glare of floodlights, her concerns were the ramblings of a grief-touched woman, or, as young Buck Hankins had crudely put it, a zombie looking for gremlins in the gearbox. The daylight world, with its bluster and noise, had little patience for the subtle disquiet that thrived in the shadows. Her warnings were dismissed as the obsessive fussing of someone who'd seen one tragedy and now expected another around every corner. "She's just spooked," is all. Marty overheard one of the older welders tell a newcomer, lost her closest pal in the Willow Creek cave-in, sees ghosts in every shadow now. Best to just nod and let her be. The camp, a raw collection of trailers and temporary barracks huddled against the mountain's flank, began to cleave. It wasn't a loud or violent split, more a quiet drawing of lines. On one side were the scoffers, the loud, confident men who dealt in absolutes and saw Marty's meticulous observations as a sign of a mind unhinged. They'd tap their heads when she walked by, their laughter a rough, dismissive sound that bounced off the cold metal of the workshops. There goes Marty, off to count the rivets again. One might jeer, but there was another group, smaller, quieter, mostly younger men, who watched Marty with a different kind of attention. They were the ones less calloused by years of routine, their eyes not yet narrowed by the conviction that they'd seen it all. Leading this faction, if it could even be called that, was Cody McCall, barely 20, an intern engineer fresh from college, with a shock of sandy hair that always seemed to be falling into his earnest blue eyes. Cody was a long way from the sun-baked Texas plains he called home. He was quiet, observant, and possessed a sharp mind that was still open enough to question. To learn, he'd taken to lingering after his official shift ended, ostensibly to study the complex schematics Marty kept pinned above her small workbench in the corner of the machine shop. "Miss Marty," he'd begun one evening, his voice hesitant. "That pressure differential you were talking about on the number 2 intake. I was looking at the specs from the Denver office. They don't quite tally. Do they?" Marty had looked up from the pot of stew she was stirring for the midnight crew, a rare, faint smile touching her lips. "No, Cody, they don't, not by a long shot." She paused, then gestured with her ladle towards the schematics. "Ever learn to read the mountain? Cody, not just the paper it's drawn on. He hadn't, not really, but he was willing to try. Under the dim glow of a utility light, Marty would trace lines on the blueprints with a calloused finger, explaining the flow of forces, the stress points, the subtle language of a structure designed to hold back a world of water. Cody listened, not with the polite deference of a student, but with the focused intensity of someone who sensed the truth in her quiet words. He started his own notebook, cross-referencing her observations with the official build logs, his brow furrowed in concentration. "She ain't crazy, you know," Cody told young Pete, another apprentice, one afternoon when they were hauling rebar. "The things she's pointing out, they're small, yeah, but they're deliberate, like someone's leaving little breadcrumbs, only these ones lead to a cliff." Pete had just shrugged, unnerved by the conviction in Cody's voice. "Man, I just want to finish this job and get back to civilization. Don't need no more trouble." The casual dismissal, the easy turning away, was what Marty had fought against for years. But Cody's quiet belief was a small, warm ember in the vast coldness of her isolation. He didn't offer pity, which she would have rejected, but a steady, intelligent regard that acknowledged her skill, her experience. Sometimes, when he'd ask a particularly insightful question, their eyes would meet, and for a fleeting moment, the weariness in hers would be met with a spark of shared understanding. It wasn't romance, not in the way the dime novels portrayed it, but it was a connection, fragile yet vital, in a place that was designed to break things. One particularly frigid night, the kind where the air itself seemed to crackle with frost, Marty was hunched over a set of newly delivered revisions to the primary spillway designs. The official stamps were all there, the signatures crisp, but as she traced the flow lines, compared them to the older versions she'd practically memorized, a chill far deeper than the mountain air settled into her bones. It was subtle, cunningly so. A slight alteration in the curvature here, a minuscule change in the load-bearing calculations there. Individually, each change was almost imperceptible, well within acceptable tolerances, but taken together, they painted a terrifying picture. They were orchestrating a weakness, a single, critical point of failure, woven into the very fabric of the dam from its conception. This wasn't just sloppy work or isolated sabotage of components on site. This was bigger, deeper. Someone, somewhere with access to the core design, had deliberately, methodically, introduced a fatal flaw. She leaned back, the cheap wooden chair creaking under her slight weight, the rhythmic hum of the distant generators, usually a comforting sound, now seemed to throb with a sinister pulse. Her mind raced back to Willow Creek, to the rumble that had started deep in the earth, the screams, the churning water. Ben's face, eyes wide with disbelief, just before the world had turned to mud and darkness. She pressed her hands to her eyes, not to block out the images, but to steady herself. This wasn't just about faulty valves or strange welds anymore. This was about a betrayal at the highest level, a catastrophe engineered before the first shovel had even broken ground. Cody found her like that, still at the table, the schematic spread out like a map of impending doom, the first pale light of dawn painting the frosted windows gray. He'd come in early, a habit now, a thermos of coffee in his hand. He stopped short when he saw her face, the usual weariness replaced by a stark, raw dread that made her look older, more fragile than he'd ever seen her. "Miss Marty," he asked softly, his Texas drawl gentle. "You all right?" She lowered her hands, her eyes finding his. The shadows beneath them were vast, but in their depths, a new, fierce light was kindling. "No, Cody," she said, her voice raspy but firm. "I'm not, and if what I'm seeing here is true, none of us are." She gestured to the blueprints. "They're not just building a dam. Son, I think someone's building a coffin." The silence in the small office was broken only by the distant sigh of the wind, a mournful sound that seemed to echo the fear now taking root in both their hearts. The long nights of lonely vigilance had led to this, a terrifying clarity, and the daunting realization that the fight to be heard, to prevent another Willow Creek, had only just begun. And this time, Marty knew she couldn't afford to be just the woman who never sleeps. She had to be the woman who made them listen. The dawn that followed Marty's chilling pronouncement about the blueprints, that someone was building a coffin, brought with it no comfort, only a sharper edge to the biting wind. Cody McCall, his youthful face etched with a gravity that hadn't been there weeks before, had simply nodded, his gaze fixed on the damning schematics, "What do we do, Miss Marty?" he'd asked, the question hanging heavy in the frigid air of her small office. "We keep our eyes open, Cody," she'd replied, her voice low and steady, betraying none of the turmoil that churned within. "And we listen to what the mountain's tellin' us. It's talkin' louder now." It was less than a week later when the mountain, or rather the dam's intricate innards, shouted. A minor incident. The day shift supervisor called it, the primary drainage system for the lower access tunnel seized up, flooding the passage with 3 feet of icy, stagnant water and paralyzing operations there for a good 6 hours. Men grumbled. Schedules were thrown into disarray, and blame was casually tossed around like a loose bolt. Carelessness. Most concluded an oversight. But Marty, watching the cleanup from a catwalk above, saw something more. She saw a pattern. This wasn't the first glitch. There had been the intermittent power surges to the monitoring station, the sudden pressure drops in the hydraulic lines, each dismissed as a gremlin in the system, an unavoidable hiccup in a project this vast. Now, though, standing there with the memory of those altered blueprints searing her mind, she felt a cold certainty crystallize. These weren't random failures. They were too frequent, too rhythmic, like a series of small, deliberate taps against a weakening wall. Later that night, with the taste of stale coffee bitter in her mouth and the hum of the night machinery a familiar thrum against her senses, Marty found herself drawn to an auxiliary water sensor panel deep within sub-level 3. It was a place few ever visited. Dusty and dimly lit, there was a nagging inconsistency she remembered from her initial training on the Kestrel systems, a detail about the bypass valve configuration that had seemed off even then, though she'd been too green, too deferential to question the senior engineers, the original schematics she'd studied years ago, the ones shown during her onboarding before Kestrel construction had even properly begun, had depicted a different fail-safe mechanism for that particular junction. She ran a calloused finger over the cool metal housing of the sensor currently in place. It didn't feel right. Her memory, honed by years of sleepless vigilance and an almost painful attention to detail, was usually as reliable as a well-oiled ratchet. The next evening, she sought out Cody. He was in the cramped mess hall, pushing tired-looking peas around his plate, the day's grime still smudged on his jaw. "Cody," she said, her voice barely above a whisper as she slid onto the bench opposite him. "I need you to do something for me. Something quiet." He looked up, his blue eyes immediately alert, sensing the urgency beneath her calm exterior. "Anything? Miss Marty, there's an archive room down past the main office. Stores the original master blueprints, the ones on that heavy vellum paper, before they get scanned and sent out to the site supervisors." He nodded slowly. "I know the place. Old Henderson keeps it locked up tighter than a drum. Henderson owes me a favor or two," Marty said, a faint, grim smile touching her lips. "I need you to get in there with me tonight. We need to compare a section of the spillway plans, the ones we're working from now, with those originals." The air in Henderson's archive room was thick with the scent of old paper and disuse. Moonlight, filtered through a single grimy window, cast long, eerie shadows. Cody, a flashlight held steady, watched as Marty, her movements economical and precise, unrolled a set of the current working blueprints on a large, dusty table. Then, with reverence, she carefully spread out the corresponding original vellum sheet retrieved from a deep, flat drawer. For a long moment, they stood side by side, the only sound their own quiet breathing and the rustle of the stiff paper. Marty's finger, gnarled from years of work but unerringly accurate, traced a specific section on both. There, she breathed, her voice tight. Cody leaned closer, his own gaze following hers. The difference was almost insultingly small, a mere fraction of an inch on paper that translated to several critical feet of concrete and steel out on the dam faces. An expansion joint, vital for allowing the massive structure to breathe with the seasonal shifts in temperature and pressure, had been subtly, almost invisibly, reduced in the working copy. It was located precisely at one of the dam's most critical stress points, where the curving wall met the granite of the mountain. "It's shorter," Cody said, his voice hushed with disbelief. "They've choked it. Like taking a knuckle out of a man's hand and expecting him to still make a fist when the pressure's on," Marty murmured, her eyes dark. This wasn't a mistake. Cody, this was done on purpose. Someone switched the designs before a single bag of cement was poured. And these little accidents we've been seeing, they're not random. They're meant to aggravate these weak spots, to help it all unravel that much faster. A new, colder dread settled over them. This wasn't just about potential mechanical failure. This was about premeditated, structural sabotage. The days that followed were filled with a quiet, desperate intensity for Marty. While going through her nightly routines, her mind was a whirlwind of calculations and connections. It was during a routine check of the automated weather station, perched on a ridge overlooking the dam site, that another piece of the puzzle clicked into place, chilling her to the core. The station was linked directly to the dam's computerized alert system, designed to trigger early warnings and controlled water releases if snowmelt or heavy rain threatened to overwhelm the reservoir. She'd noticed it subtly at first. The air on her pre-dawn walks felt colder, the frost thicker on the ground than the station's official temperature logs indicated. Her bones, seasoned by decades in the high country, were a more reliable barometer than any fancy gauge. One morning, the discrepancy was undeniable. Her old mercury thermometer, hung outside her small cabin, read a good 7 degrees Fahrenheit. Lower than the official digital readout beamed from the weather station. The station claimed it was just above freezing. Marty knew, with the certainty of chapped skin and aching joints, that it was well into the 20s, nearly 4 degrees Celsius of difference. She calculated mentally. A gnawing suspicion took hold. Later that day, bundled against a wind that carried the first sharp needles of an incoming snow squall, Marty made her way up the slick, winding path to the weather station. The transmission cable, thick and insulated, snaked its way down the ridge towards the main control hub. She followed it, her eyes scanning for anything out of the ordinary. About halfway down, tucked behind a cluster of weathered pines, she found it, a small, crudely spliced junction box, non-standard and cleverly hidden. Inside, a simple, almost primitive electronic device was wired into the data line. It was designed to systematically alter the temperature readings before they reached the dam's control system, falsely reporting warmer conditions. Her blood ran cold. It was a diabolical piece of sabotage. By simulating milder weather, the saboteur was effectively blinding the dam's early warning system when the spring melt truly began, or if an unseasonable warm spell hit the heavy snowpack already accumulated in the high peaks. The system wouldn't react. The pressure in the reservoir would build, silent and unchecked, until it was too late. There would be no controlled release. No gradual easing of the strain, just a sudden, catastrophic surge against those deliberately weakened points. That evening, back in the relative warmth of her small office, surrounded by her notes and schematics, Marty felt a weariness that went bone deep. She was piecing together a nightmare, seeking some anchor, some piece of solid knowledge in the swirling uncertainty. She pulled out a dusty box of old operational manuals and training materials from her early days. Long before Kestrel, she was looking for anything, a forgotten procedure, a different way of thinking about stress tolerances. Her fingers, stiff with cold and fatigue, idly flipped through the pages of a manual for the old Blue River project, a dam she'd worked on under the tutelage of a brilliant, if notoriously abrasive, chief engineer. And then she saw it, a small, almost insignificant annotation in the margin of a complex hydraulic diagram. A tiny, stylized symbol, a sort of inverted triangle with a crossbar. It was a shorthand marking, unique, almost a signature. Her breath hitched. She knew that marca, it belonged to Curtis Brand. Curtis, her mentor, the man who had taught her more about the soul of a dam, its living, breathing nature, than any textbook ever could. He'd been a genius, visionary even, but stubborn, unwilling to bend to bureaucratic pressures or cut corners for expediency. He'd been fired from Blue River years ago, amidst a cloud of controversy, willful insubordination, and unauthorized design alterations. The official report had said he'd argued that his changes were essential for safety, that the company was compromising the dam's integrity for profit, but they'd silenced him, pushed him out of the industry. He'd vanished, or so everyone believed. A cold dread, sharper and more personal than anything she'd felt before, gripped Marty. Curtis, here, it didn't make sense. Yet, that symbol, it was his, unmistakably. With trembling hands, she pulled out the current Kestrel Dam employee roster, a thick printout she'd procured from a friendly clerk in HR, ostensibly to check on overtime hours for her night crew. Her eyes scanned the list of names, hundreds of them, from engineers to laborers. She was looking for something, anything that might connect. Her gaze snagged on a name she hadn't paid much attention to before, listed under Specialized Welding Inspector, a recent hire who kept to himself. R. Grant. R. Grant. She scribbled it down on a scrap of paper. Curtis Brand. She stared at the two names, her mind racing. The letters danced, rearranged themselves. C-U-R-T-I-S. B-R-A-N-D-R. G-R-A-N-T. It wasn't a perfect anagram, but the core letters, the sound, the possibility. It was too close to be a coincidence, especially with that symbol fresh in her mind. The realization hit her with the force of a physical blow. Curtis, her teacher, the man whose passion for sound engineering had ignited her own, was here, and he wasn't here to build. He was here to destroy. The bitter irony of it, the profound sense of betrayal, threatened to overwhelm her. The man who had once fought so fiercely for the integrity of these massive structures was now, it seemed, orchestrating their demise. He was dismantling everything she, his former student, was desperately trying to protect. The ghost from her past wasn't just a memory. He was flesh and blood, and he was her enemy. The name R. Grant? A flimsy mask for Curtis Brand settled in Marty's mind like a shard of ice. Her mentor, the man who'd taught her to listen to the heartbeat of concrete and steel, was now the architect of its impending death. The weight of this betrayal was a cold, physical ache, but there was no time for grief. Not yet. The dam was whispering its warnings, and now she understood the voice behind the threat. She had to act. But Curtis, it seemed, was a step ahead, his cunning honed by years of bitterness. Marty had barely voiced her suspicions about Ari, Grant's true identity to Cody, urging him to be cautious, to watch. When Curtis launched his preemptive strike, it was as swift and brutal as a winter avalanche. He orchestrated a malfunction at one of the auxiliary discharge stations, a critical valve supposedly jammed open during a routine test. It wasn't a major incident in itself, more of an operational headache, but the timing was impeccable. Within hours, meticulously falsified entries appeared in the station's technical logs. Entries penned in a hand that mimicked Marty's own tired scrawl from previous. Legitimate reports. These forged notes detailed incorrect procedures, unauthorized adjustments, all pointing directly at her. Then came the leaked anonymous technical report, landing squarely on the desk of Silas McHenry, the Kestrel Project's overall site supervisor. Silas was a man weathered by decades in the high country, his face a roadmap of hard winters and tougher decisions. He was fair-minded, known for listening more than he spoke, and Marty had always felt he held a grudging respect for her unorthodox diligence. The report, however, was a masterpiece of insinuation. It painted Marty as a woman unraveled by chronic insomnia and past trauma, her judgment clouded, her recent observations bordering on paranoid delusions, now actively, if perhaps unintentionally, sabotaging operations through misguided interference. Silas called her into his stark, utilitarian office. The ever-present scent of stale coffee and damp wool filled the air. He looked older than his 60 years, the report lying between them on the scarred wooden desk like a coiled snake. "Marty," he began, his voice gravelly, avoiding her gaze. "You know, I've always valued your input. You see things others miss." He tapped the report with a thick finger. "But this is serious. Valve misconfiguration, log tampering. The board's already screaming. It's a lie." "Silas," Marty said, her voice quiet but firm, her gaze unwavering. "Every word of it. Someone's setting me up. That valve. Those logs. I know your work." "Marty," Silas interrupted, finally meeting her eyes. His own were troubled, "and my gut tells me you're straight. But procedure is procedure. Accusations have been made. Evidence presented. I've got no choice but to suspend you. Pending a full investigation." He looked away then, out the window at the swirling snow that had begun to fall. "Officially, you're a risk. Unofficially." He trailed off, but Marty understood. His hands were tied. "I understand, Silas," she said, a profound weariness settling over her. But beneath the weariness, a cold resolve was hardening. If they wouldn't listen, she'd find a way to show them. Before the security escort, a young man named Billy, who looked deeply uncomfortable with his task, walked her to the site's main gate. Marty made one last, unobserved stop in her small workshop. Her hands moved with deft, practiced speed. From a discarded security camera with a cracked lens, she salvaged the optical assembly. An old electric fan, one she'd tinkered with months ago, yielded its small, surprisingly robust motor, which she quickly adapted into a rudimentary power stabilizer. A few wires, a small, high-capacity battery pack she'd kept charged for her heavy-duty flashlight, and a bit of black electrical tape completed her creation. A self-contained, semi-mechanical recording device. It was crude, but it would work. She knew where the blind spots were. the forgotten corners of the dam's infrastructure. Under the watchful, apologetic eyes of Billy, she packed a small duffel bag with a few clothes, a thermos, and her precious, waterproof night journal. She climbed into the company truck designated to take her down the mountain to the nearest town. The snow was falling harder now, a thick white curtain descending, promising to obliterate tracks and muffle sounds. The truck rumbled away from the main compound. Marty watched the lights of Kestrel Dam recede in the rearview mirror, a pang of something akin to despair tightening her chest. Then, about a mile down the winding access road, where a dense stand of lodgepole pines pressed close to the asphalt, she leaned forward. "Billy," she said, her voice calm, "pull over here for a moment. Would you? Nature calls." The urgent kind. The young guard, flustered, complied. Marty clambered out into the swirling snow, disappearing behind the thick trees. Billy waited, the truck's engine idling, its headlights cutting a swath through the falling flakes. 5 minutes passed, then 10. Finally, with a sigh of exasperation and a touch of unease, he got out, calling her name. There was no answer but the sighing of the wind through the pines. Marty Jones had vanished. She hadn't gone far. Doubling back, moving with a silent, practiced tread through the snow-choked woods, she skirted the main security checkpoints. Her knowledge of the terrain, her greatest ally. The Kestrel Dam was a labyrinth of concrete and steel, and she knew its secret passages, its forgotten access tunnels, better than any man alive. Her destination was the Northern Technical Level, a rarely visited section housing tertiary control systems, a place she instinctively felt Curtis would target for his final, critical act of sabotage. Before she'd left her workshop, she'd tucked her homemade camera into a junction box overlooking a key valve assembly in that sector, its lens peeking out almost invisibly, hidden in a cramped, ice-cold maintenance crawlspace, overlooking the hum and throb of the machinery. Marty waited. Hours bled into one another. The cold gnawed at her, but she fought it back. Fueled by coffee from her thermos and a grim determination, the snowstorm raged outside, a symphony of wind and ice against the dam's massive walls. It was the perfect cover for Curtis. Then, she saw him, a shadowy figure moving with quiet purpose through the dimly lit corridor below. R. Grant. Curtis Brand. He carried a heavy-looking satchel. Marty's breath caught in her throat. He moved directly to the primary pressure expansion valve system for the northern sector, one of the very joints she and Cody had seen deliberately weakened in the altered blueprints. From her vantage point, her heart pounding against her ribs, she watched as Curtis carefully unpacked his satchel. It wasn't a simple timer-activated explosive. It was far more insidious. He was wiring a device directly into the dam's own sensory network, a complex array of temperature and pressure gauges that monitored the structure's stress. The main charge, she could now see, was being intricately linked to these sensors. It wouldn't detonate on a clock. It would detonate when the spring thaws arrived, when the melting snowpack sent torrents of water into the reservoir, when the pressure on the weakened dam wall reached a precisely calculated breaking point. It was designed to use the dam's own body against itself, a Trojan horse of wires and malice. Marty's mind raced, memorizing the configuration, the way he bypassed certain inputs and amplified others, the sheer diabolical genius of it. He was making the dam itself the trigger for its own destruction, a mechanism so deeply integrated it would be almost impossible to detect through standard system diagnostics. The beauty of the design, its lethal elegance, was a chilling testament to Curtis's perverted brilliance. She had to get closer, to document the final connections, the specific frequencies he might be using. Taking a shallow breath, Marty eased herself from the crawlspace, moving like a wraith along a narrow, shadowy catwalk. A loose piece of gravel skittered under her worn boot. A tiny sound amplified 100-fold in the echoing silence. Curtis froze. His head snapped up, his eyes, like chips of glacial ice, scanning the darkness. He saw her. For a heartbeat, neither moved. Then Curtis lunged, not towards her, but towards an alarm panel. Marty reacted instantly, launching herself from the catwalk, landing hard on the concrete floor below, the impact jarring through her bones. She scrambled up, adrenaline surging, and fled down a narrow service corridor, Curtis's heavy footsteps pounding behind her. The chase was a desperate, terrifying ballet in the frozen guts of the dam. Icy condensation made the metal stairways slick as glass. Her pursuer was younger, stronger, but Marty had the advantage of intimacy with this cold, concrete world. She knew its twists, its turns, its dead ends. She led him through a maze of pipes and machinery, the air burning in her lungs, the sound of his pursuit a relentless drumbeat. He was gaining. She could hear his ragged breathing closer now. Ahead, she saw the entrance to an old, decommissioned technical tunnel, one she'd personally helped clear and unofficially repair early in the year. Reinforcing a crumbling section, it was a long shot, ducking into the pitch-black opening. She fumbled for the tripwire she'd strung across it months ago as a simple precaution. A piece of high-tensile fishing line connected to a precariously balanced stack of old tin cans inside. Just as Curtis's shadow filled the tunnel entrance, she pulled. The clang and rattle of the cans echoed like gunshots in the confined space. Curtis swore, momentarily startled, his silhouette hesitating. It was the only chance she needed. Marty plunged deeper into the darkness, her hand outstretched, finding a familiar ladder. She scrambled down, her other hand scraping raw against the rough concrete wall, her back slamming into a protruding pipe. Pain shot through her, but she ignored it. Curtis's light flashed above, then receded. He'd lost her trail in the unexpected cacophony. She found herself in a small, forgotten chamber beneath the main structure, a place where the constant thrum of the dam's machinery was a palpable vibration in the floor and walls. Her hand was bleeding freely, her back throbbed, and a deep, shuddering chill was setting in. But she was alive, and she had seen. With trembling, bloodied fingers, she pulled her waterproof journal and a pencil from her pocket. By the dim, emergency glow of a nearby status light, she began to sketch, her lines surprisingly steady despite the pain and cold. She drew the complex circuitry, the sensor bypasses, the exact placement of the charges, every detail Curtis Brand had so meticulously assembled. Alone in the belly of the beasts, surrounded by the cold, indifferent power of the dam, Marty looked at her drawings. The wind howled outside, a mournful song of the coming devastation. She touched the paper, her own breath misting in the frigid air. "This thing isn't on a timer," she whispered, the words barely audible above the groan of the machinery. Her eyes, shadowed but fiercely alive, stared into the darkness. "It's listening to the snow." What did you think of today's story? If it made your day, drop a good in the comments. If it didn't hit the mark, just type 1. Got your own thoughts? I'd love to hear them below. And hey, don't forget to hit subscribe. It's free. and it really helps the channel grow. Thank you so much for being here. The snow, which had begun as a deceptive veil, now fell with a vengeance, a thick, suffocating blanket intent on burying the world. From her frigid, makeshift sanctuary deep within the dam's forgotten underbelly, Marty Jones could feel the mountain groaning under the accumulating weight. The tampered weather station, she knew, would still be broadcasting its lies of a mild, manageable snowfall to the control room far above, but Marty's own internal barometer, honed by a lifetime in the high country and the raw ache in her recently injured back, told a different, more terrifying story. The temperature was plummeting, and the sheer volume of fresh snow piling onto the existing pack meant that the reservoir's water pressure was climbing, fast and silent, towards the catastrophic threshold Curtis Brand had so meticulously engineered. Hours, she figured, maybe less, if his device, listening intently to the dam's distress, wasn't neutralized. Kestrel Dam would become another tombstone in the unforgiving Rockies. She had to reach Silas McHenry. It was a desperate gamble. Her waterproof journal, filled with her meticulous drawings of Curtis's device, her observations, her fears. She'd left it tucked inside Silas's office desk drawer, a silent testament slipped there during the brief, chaotic moments before her official departure, a hope against hope that the man whose gruff exterior sometimes hid a flicker of understanding might find it, might read it, might believe, using a maintenance phone in a deserted relay station, its line miraculously still active. She made the call. Her voice was a hoarse whisper, her words stark and urgent. She didn't plead, didn't embellish. She just stated the facts, the imminent danger, the location of the primary device. There was a long silence on the other end, broken only by the crackle of the old line and the distant howl of the wind. Marty's heart hammered against her ribs. Had she misjudged him? Then, Silas's voice, rougher than usual. "Your journal, Marty. I read it, cover to cover." Another pause. Met Curtis Brand once, years ago. Before the Willow Creek mess. He had a younger brother, David, a good kid, geologist. The unspoken filled the space between them. He's using the dam's own sensors to trigger it. Silas, Marty pressed, her breath clouding in the icy air. It's designed to look like a structural failure due to the storm. He's at the number 3 sensor array, northern sector, lower access tunnel. I know the spot, Silas said, a new, grim resolve in his tone. The snow's already making the main roads impassable. Most of the crew's been pulled back to base. No one's going to be looking for us down there. Meet me at the old ventilation shaft. West side, in 20 minutes. And Marty, he added, his voice dropping, be careful. This ain't just about the dam anymore. Is it? The journey to the sensor array was a descent into a frozen hell. Silas, his face a mask of grim determination, moved with surprising agility for a man his age, his silence a heavy counterpoint to Marty's focused urgency. They navigated treacherous, ice-slicked steel catwalks and narrow, echoing corridors where the wind, finding its way through unseen conduits, shrieked like a banshee. Drifts of fine, powdery snow had already begun to accumulate even here, deep in the bowels of the earth, a chilling reminder of the storm's relentless power above. Marty carried her latest invention, a simple pressure listening device. She'd fashioned it from a discarded piezoelectric sensor, a battered tin can scavenged from a trash heap, and a length of thin, insulated wire connected to an old set of headphones. It was crude, but it was sensitive. As they neared the heavily reinforced access door to the number 3 sensor chamber, she pressed the can against the cold, vibrating concrete of the dam wall. She listened intently, her eyes closed, filtering out the groan of stressed metal and the howl of the wind. Then she heard it, a discordant rhythm beneath the surface noise, a series of irregular pressure fluctuations. "The dam is breathing," she murmured, pulling off the headphones, her expression bleak, unevenly, unnaturally, like something's waiting to spring. Silas nodded grimly, his hand resting on the heavy pry bar he carried. The chamber itself was a vault of reinforced concrete, housing the critical sensors that monitored the dam's integrity. Curtis, she knew, would have concealed his device meticulously, likely behind the protective rock shielding that encased the primary valve assembly. As Silas began to work the pry bar into a crevice in the rock shielding, a voice cut through the dim, frigid air, sharp and laced with a chilling amusement. "I was wondering when you'd show up, Martha, and you brought a friend. How disappointing." Curtis Brand stepped out from the deeper shadows of an adjacent alcove, a powerful, long-barreled revolver held steady in one hand, a small, dark remote device in the other. His eyes, those chips of glacial ice Marty remembered, glittered with a fanatic's light. The storm outside seemed to have found its human embodiment in him. "It's over, Curtis," Marty said, her voice surprisingly steady, positioning herself slightly in front of Silas. "We know about the device. We know about the sensors. Over?" Curtis laughed, a harsh, broken sound. "Oh, it's just beginning. My dear, this monument to arrogance is about to sing its swan song." He gestured with the gun toward Silas, "and he gets a front row seat to the concert he helped compose." "What are you talking about, Brand?" Silas demanded, his face pale but resolute. Curtis's gaze, filled with a chilling mixture of grief and venom, fixed on Silas. "I'm talking about my brother, David Brand. He died in the Willow Creek collapse 7 years ago, drowned in mud and ignorance because men like you cut corners, ignored warnings." His voice cracked. "Silas McHenry, you were deputy commander then, weren't you? You signed off on the safety reports. And when it all came tumbling down, no one paid. No one truly answered for men like David." Silas stared, comprehension dawning in his eyes, a look of profound shock and dawning, horrified guilt. "David, my God, he was your brother." The name, Marty saw, struck Silas like a physical blow. He remembered. "Yes," Curtis hissed, his knuckles white on the grip of the gun. "He believed in building things that lasted. You, and men like you, taught him that was a fool's dream. So, I decided it was time for a different lesson. Time to show the world that these things," he gestured around them, "are just tools of destruction waiting for the wrong hands, or the negligent ones. This isn't justice." "Curtis," Marty said softly, her eyes never leaving his, "this is just more pain, more loss. It's a reckoning." Curtis spat. He raised the remote, "And it starts now. This storm is my conductor's baton." His thumb hovered over a button. Marty knew they had seconds, as Curtis's attention was fixed on his monologue of vengeance, on Silas's stricken face. Her mind raced. The sensors. He was going to use the remote to override any final safety protocols, to ensure the device armed and listened for that peak pressure. But his device was listening for heat, too. The heat of a rapid thaw. Her eyes darted to the small, high-intensity mini-welding torch she always carried in her kit for emergency repairs. It was a long shot, almost insane. "Silas," she whispered, not taking her eyes off Curtis. "When I move, create a diversion. Anything?" Curtis sneered, touching, but too late. His thumb began to press down. "Now, Silas," Marty yelled. Silas, reacting with surprising speed, heaved the heavy pry bar. It clanged loudly against a steel support beam near Curtis, not hitting him, but startling him just enough. In that split second of distraction, Marty lunged towards the exposed sensor array Curtis had been working on, the mini-torch already ignited in her hand, its needlepoint flame hissing. She jammed the intense blue flame directly onto the primary thermal sensor Curtis had wired into his explosive device. It was meant to detect the ambient temperature rise of a natural thaw. She was giving it an artificial, concentrated blast of heat. "What are you doing?" Curtis shrieked, realizing her intent, his face contorting in alarm. The explosive device, tricked into thinking a massive, sudden snowmelt was occurring, that temperatures were soaring, began its premature activation sequence. Warning lights on Curtis's own remote flashed erratically. Alarms he hadn't anticipated began to chirp from within the device itself. It was arming too fast, out of his control, before the actual water pressure had reached its absolute peak. Before he was truly ready for the grand, fatal crescendo, he panicked. His eyes darted between Marty, the rapidly arming device, and his remote, which was now blinking a sequence he didn't recognize. That was the opening Marty needed. While Curtis was reeling, his plan unraveling, she threw herself at the device itself, ignoring the searing pain in her injured back. Her fingers, nimble despite the cold and her thick gloves, found the primary lead wire she'd identified in her earlier observations, the one connecting the detonator core to its dedicated high-yield power battery. There was no time for finesse. She gripped her linesman's pliers, took a deep breath, and squeezed. Snip! The wire parted with a dull click. The frantic warning lights on the device blinked one last time, then went dark. A profound, echoing silence descended, broken only by the three of them panting in the frigid air and the undiminished howl of the wind outside. A storm that had lost its deadly accomplice. Curtis stared at the now inert device, then at Marty, his face a mask of disbelief and thwarted rage. The gun wavered in his hand. Before he could react further, Silas, moving with the force of a man unburdened, tackled him. The revolver clattered across the icy floor. The fight was brief, desperate, and ended with Silas pinning a struggling, defeated Curtis Brand. Later, as the first pale light of a storm-battered dawn filtered into the high country and the immediate threat had passed, Marty stood with Silas near the secured entrance to the tunnel. Curtis was subdued, awaiting the arrival of the authorities Silas had summoned. Silas looked at Marty, his face etched with exhaustion and a deep, somber understanding. "You saved us, Marty, all of us." He would have let it all go. Marty nodded, her gaze distant, thinking of Ben, of the Willow Creek disaster, of the long, dark road that had led her here. He was lost in his own storm. Silas, like I almost was once. She looked at the bound figure of Curtis Brand, a man consumed by a grief that had festered into a terrible vengeance. Killing him wouldn't have brought his brother back. It just makes more monsters. It was a lesson learned in the crucible of her own past, a hard-won wisdom that, in the heart of the roaring storm, had allowed her not just to disarm a bomb, but to hold on to a piece of her own soul. The dam still stood, breathing a little easier now, under a sky slowly clearing to a bruised, uncertain blue. The aftermath of the confrontation in the dam's frozen underbelly was as quiet and cold as the receding storm. With Curtis Brand's intricate device disarmed, its malevolent hum silenced just moments before it could unleash catastrophe. The Kestrel Dam stood against the bruised dawn, against the weight of the snow-laden peaks, a silent testament to a battle fought and won in its echoing darkness. Curtis, his face a blank mask of defeat, was led away by the grim-faced authorities Silas had summoned. No more lives were lost to the ghosts of Willow Creek. No new wounds torn open to fester into another generation's vengeance. Silas Kane, his arm in a makeshift sling where he'd wrenched it, subduing Brand, and his face etched with a weariness that went deeper than physical injury, found Marty near the main control room. The hum of the generators was a steady, reassuring pulse now. The readouts on the myriad screens stable. He was to be temporarily suspended, he told her, pending the inevitable inquiries and reports, a formality, but also a necessary pause, before the transport vehicle arrived to take him down the mountain. He stopped before her. The usual bluster was gone, replaced by a quiet gravity. "Marty," he began, his voice raspy, the words seeming to cost him some effort. He looked out at the vast, intricate network of the dam, then back at her, a woman who seemed almost too slight to have shouldered such a monumental burden. "You kept this thing standing when no one else would even look, when I wouldn't look close enough." He shook his head, a flicker of the old pain regarding David Brand, and now his brother Curtis, shadowing his eyes. "I owe you a dam, Marty, and a whole lot more than just a lesson in engineering." There was a moment of shared silence, an understanding that passed between them deeper than words. He offered her his good hand. She took it. Her grip was firm, calloused, steady. In the days that followed, as the Kestrel Dam project slowly returned to a semblance of normalcy, whispers of Marty's quiet heroism began to circulate. Management, eager to smooth over the near disaster, and perhaps recognizing a rare talent, offered her a promotion, Chief Oversight Technician, a newly minted title with a significant pay raise and a permanent day shift. Marty listened politely, then declined. The daylight, the official channels, the meetings and commendations, they weren't her world. Her place had always been in the shadows, listening to the whispers of the machinery, to the unspoken anxieties of the structure itself. She left Kestrel Dam as quietly as she had often moved through its sleeping corridors. No grand farewells, no speeches. On the main operations desk, where the shift supervisors usually laid out their plans, she left her worn, leather-bound night journal. It was young Cody McCall, the intern whose quiet belief had been a small, steady flame in the darkness. Who found it? He opened it, his eyes scanning the meticulous notes, the intricate, hand-drawn schematics of stresses and strains, the almost poetic observations of the dam's nightly moods, and the chillingly accurate diagrams of Curtis's devices. He looked up, his expression a mixture of awe and a profound, dawning respect. She saw it all. He breathed to the day shift foreman standing nearby. She saw everything, before any of us even bothered to look. There was no storybook ending for Marty Jones. No ride into a conveniently painted sunset with a newfound love. The bond she shared with Silas, forged in crisis and cemented by a shared understanding of loss and responsibilities, needed no romantic label. It was a connection of grizzled souls who had stared into an abyss and helped each other step back from the edge. They would go their separate ways, each carrying the imprint of the other, each changed in ways that would continue to unfold in the quiet solitude of their own paths. That, in itself, was a kind of profound, unspoken commitment. Months later, in a dusty, forgotten town nestled in a high desert valley many miles from the shadow of the Rocky Mountains, an old, abandoned brick warehouse began to show signs of life. A new, hand-painted wooden sign hung crookedly above its wide doors. It read, "Night Shift Mechanics, for women who don't sleep." Inside, the cavernous space was slowly being transformed. In one corner stood a surprisingly detailed miniature model of a hydroelectric dam, its tiny spillways and turbine housings crafted with loving precision, charts displaying images of sensor arrays, complex wiring diagrams, and stress tolerance calculations were tacked to the rough walls. Workbenches held examples of welding joins, disassembled motors, and mock-ups of emergency override systems. Marty Jones didn't lecture in the traditional sense. She moved among the small group of women, some young, escaping dead-end jobs, some older, seeking a new start, or simply a place where their restless night energy could find purpose. With a quiet intensity, she told stories, her voice low and even, tales of metal fatigue, of listening to the subtle shifts in a generator's hum, of the feel of a bearing about to seize. She asked questions, encouraging them to think for themselves, to trust their own observations, their own hands. She taught them how to read the language of machinery, how to diagnose an unseen flaw, how to respond in a crisis. But more than that, she taught them how to listen to the silence within themselves, to find their own strength in the quiet hours when the rest of the world was asleep. Another year turned. The deep snows of winter gave way to the tentative warmth of spring. High in the Rockies, the great thaw began. Marty drove the familiar winding road back towards Kestrel Dam. The windows of her old truck rolled down, the scent of pine and damp earth filling the cab. The valley below the dam was a vibrant tapestry of new green. The reservoir, full and calm, reflected the clear, washed blue of the mountain sky. Water flowed steadily, peacefully, through the spillway gates. The dam was doing its job, just as it was meant to. She parked near the massive base of the structure, the concrete warm from the morning sun. She walked to a spot she knew, a place near the foundation where the earth still bore faint scars from the desperate work done during that terrible storm. There, almost hidden unless you knew where to look, was a small, burnished steel plaque, its edges expertly welded to the rough concrete. The inscription was simple, etched in clean, strong lines. Built in daylight, protected in darkness, M.J. Marty stood before it for a long time, the vastness of the dam soaring above her. No tears fell. Her grief for Ben, for the life she'd known before, was a quiet current that would always run within her. But it no longer threatened to pull her under. She had faced the ghosts of her past, and in doing so, had helped another lost soul avoid becoming a ghost himself. The wind, gentler now than she remembered it, whispered through the pines, carrying the scent of meltwater and new beginnings. Finally, she turned and walked away, her shadow stretching long in the morning light. Behind her, the Kestrel Dam stood solid and unwavering, a sentinel against the wild heart of the mountains. It was a monument to human ingenuity, to ambition, to the taming of great power. But now, its story was more than just concrete and steel. Now, It was also a story of vigilance, of courage, of a quiet woman who had stayed awake so that others could sleep, safe in the knowledge that someone was listening to the breathing of the structure in the deep of the night. And this time, they knew. They all knew. What did this story stir in you? Did you feel the tension building like a frozen dam ready to break, or the quiet strength of someone who chooses to stay and fight? I'd love to hear your thoughts. Drop a comment below and tell me which moment hit you hardest. If you want more stories about ordinary people doing extraordinary things in the face of danger, hit that subscribe button. New chapters coming soon, and they only get wilder from here.